Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I hope you guys are all doing great today. It is a beautiful day here in early May, and I am in the shade garden today to talk about a plant that I think is both simultaneously loved and hated at the same time. And I'll get to what I mean by that later. And that, of course, is lily of the valley. So I just want to talk a little bit about just the basics of lily of the valley and some very important considerations to keep in mind if you are considering putting this in your garden. So first and foremost, lily of the valley, despite their name, are actually not lilies at all. They're kind of just called that. I'm not entirely sure why. Another name for them actually is maybells, and I think that is rather appropriate seeing how they are blooming here in the beginning of May, which is very nice. A very nice name. Now, of course, that can vary depending on where you live, but you get the gist. So, where was I? Yes. So, yeah, they are these beautiful spring blooming perennials that are pretty easy to grow, but do have some quirks about them, let's just say, that you should be aware of. So, first and foremost, what do they like? So first of all, they do appreciate, actually, and this is one of the great things about them, they do really well in a shady spot, which I think is invaluable, especially if you have a lot of shade. I personally don't, but for those of you that do, this is a great flower to have in the shade. They tolerate shade very, very well, and aren't they so pretty? And they're wonderful plants for the shade. They do, however, they can handle a little bit of sun. These lily of the valley that I have right here, I actually got from my workplace where I work. The people I work with were nice enough to let me have some of the lily of the valley. They were kind of thinning. So they let me have some, and I decided to put them in this shady spot, and they do really well. So, but I have seen them do really well in some sun. Now, that can be fudged if you remember the watering. So, lily of the valley, I would say, has average water needs, meaning not too much, but not too little. If you have them in a little bit more sun, it's probably best to water them a little bit more often than if they are in the shade like mine are. So that's important to keep in mind. They're not excessive drinkers or anything like that. They don't need a ton of water. But if you do have them in a sunnier spot, I would definitely give them a little bit extra water. Now, regardless of where you have, as far as feeding is concerned, I would say that if you have even relatively decent soil, feeding should not be necessary. You can, and I actually did this. I was emptying one of my pots, and I just sprinkled some of my old potting mix from an old pot. I had to refresh the soil, and I put it on there, and I'm not going to feed them at all next year. So this area also gets a lot of leaf drop because this is underneath a tree. So I think this soil is already decent in and of itself. So, but if you have, like I said, if you have relatively decent soil, feeding should not be necessary. And in fact, might actually not be a good idea to feed them at all. Because I will explain this later, as I mentioned before. So that's sort of the feeding. Now, I was talking about that it might not be a good idea to feed them, and you probably know where I'm going with this. These things they like to travel, if you will. If you are not careful, they can kind of spread out of control. And this is kind of what I mean when I say they are sort of a lot of people have a love-hate relationship. Like, I love the pretty blooms, but you don't love the way that it spreads out of control. So you need to have them in a spot where they can be easily contained, where they cannot spread out of control, choke out other plants, and especially if you can help it, try not to let them escape into the wild. because these are not native here and they can become invasive if you're not careful. I think it's less of a problem when they're in a controlled area. This is kind of a spot where I feel pretty comfortable just kind of letting them kind of freely roam, but I would not plant them next to like woods or anything like that, at least if you live here in North America, because these plants, this species that I have, or at least I'm assuming I have, can be very invasive. So just keep that in mind, that if you want them, make sure you have a way to contain it if necessary. And I guarantee you it probably will be necessary at some point. So that is important to consider. The other thing that I think is vital to understand about this plant is, despite its, I think, pretty infatuating beauty, is kind of a sinister side to it. And that is its toxicity. This plant is extremely poisonous, and I want to emphasize this. This is not a plant to have if you have a lot of small children that like to eat, put things in their mouths, or you have puppies. I actually have a puppy, or just dogs in general that like to eat things. I have a puppy, and I have to make sure to keep her away from these because she is still very much in her nibbling phase. Which, yes, is annoying, but it is very important to remember with plants like this, they can be very poisonous, and enough of it can kill you or your pet. So it is very important to remember that these are extremely poisonous. And obviously I am not a medical expert at all, but I would recommend that if you do suspect it, that you get them to the hospital as soon as possible. Like I said, I'm not a medical expert, but this is a medical emergency if any part of the plant is consumed. Now, touching it seems to be fine. I've never had any ill effects touching it. However, I would just wash my hands really well after touching it. So, but yeah, they are very pretty, but they are kind of a double-edged sword, so you have to be very careful where you plant this. So, but like I said, there are many beautiful things about it, and I think if you are aware of those things, I think it is a plant you can really enjoy. And the other thing also, what's really neat about them, is sometimes if you have multiple different unique colonies, they can actually produce really pretty red berries in the fall, which I think are really pretty. But those are also really poisonous, and I think that's probably where they can be at their most dangerous. So make sure, again, if you have pets or small children, that they do not eat any part of the plant, whether it be the roots, the leaves, the flowers, anything. Do not let them eat anything, including those berries. But they are very pretty nonetheless. So yeah, I feel like I went on a little bit too much about that, but I do feel like it is very important to remember that. Like, it is not a joke. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit just about Lily of the Valley, and I don't want to scare you against planting it because it is very pretty, and like I said, if you're aware of it, I think they can be a really pretty plant, and you can just take precautions to make sure that they are handled and treated appropriately. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with Lily of the Valley, and I hope you'll give it a try if you haven't. And like I said, don't be scared. I think it's really, really pretty, and it smells wonderful. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you have anything to add, I would love to hear. And please leave a comment, like, and subscribe, and do all those wonderful things. And I will see you guys in another video here very soon. Thanks for watching.